Let me again remind ourselves of one of the remarks of Madame de Salzmann that was actually sent to everybody, and we'll be focusing on. You don't love yourself enough, the self that wishes and needs to emerge. Do I have a self like that? How do I know? Let me make a few general remarks here before specifically attending to this question. One is that, in a way, one can say, I think Gurdjieff himself would have said that everything that is being brought by him is in fact very traditional. All the great spiritual traditions have come with those very kinds of remarks, perhaps in slightly different language, but that he brought this teaching for the modern mind. And also, therefore, occasionally using a very modernistic language. What is the characteristic of the modern mind? All of us are very strongly influenced by the scientific and technological mode. And here I would refer to specifically two aspects of it. One is, even if a very great scientist like Newton or Einstein said something, that doesn't become the truth. Can that be verified by any serious scientist? So similarly here, if this remark is made even by a great sage, how do I actually relate with it? How do I verify it? Secondly, for a scientific truth to be truth, it has to be transnational, transcultural, transgeographic. If Newton's laws of motion apply only in England, they are not true laws of nature. But of course, an Englishman has to begin to verify them, starting with measurements in England. Somebody in China has to begin with measurements from there. So we need to begin from where we are. But the truth is not limited by geography or by language. But we are limited by our geography and language. So it's always a call to try to understand something beyond my own conditioned self. Which is why in almost every serious teaching, there is a call to be, how can I become more and more free of my usual conditioned self? Sometimes it is put very strongly, how can I die to my usual self? Sometimes it's put a little lightly, how can I be free of my usual self? Or, for example, a remark of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. So this kind of remark is really to convey again and again that, of course, I need to begin from where I am, but how can I hear or see something which is not completely occupied by my conditioned self? So here, to approach this, of course, as I said, we are all conditioned by the scientific mindset. Something has to be universally true, if it is true. And I ought to be able to verify it or to experience it. But here is a tricky thing. If the Buddha said something based on his experience, I cannot actually experience that unless I come to the level or the quality of the Buddha himself. Now, therefore, if I were to say, well, that's not my experience, therefore I dismiss it, then I would more or less, I'm asking myself to remain at the level where I am. This is where it is very important also to realize that sometimes, maybe not always, certain remarks or statements of the great sages resonate in us, mostly to our feeling. We almost feel as if there is a kind of a fragrance of truth in it, or a flare of truth in what they're saying, even though it is not my experience at present. So I don't therefore dismiss it, but wonder how can I actually evolve internally so that I could actually experience what the Buddha is saying about the truth, certain kind of truth. So this is a very slightly different enterprise here, that even though it does not now correspond to my experience, is there something in me which usually, as I said, is really the feeling, which is a little bit touched by this and gets a sense that there is some truth in it, something I cannot easily dismiss. And in any case, if we, for whatever reason, feel that we are following, let us say, the Gurdjieff teaching, then if I don't feel innerly that what Gurdjieff brought, or later on, much more what we are here speaking about, what Madame de Salzman said, if these remarks are not coming from a higher quality of understanding, from a person with a higher level of being, then why follow this teaching? But if it is coming from a higher level, then it is important for me not easily to dismiss these remarks, even though at present they don't correspond to my experience, or I may not even understand it. Then the question then arises, how do I understand it? How do I approach it? How do I begin? From wherever I am. I cannot begin from Mount Everest. I cannot begin from the level of Madame de Salzman or Gurdjieff. I need to begin from where I am. But then there are certain other remarks which are relevant before we can approach this question. One is that everything in the manifested universe actually has come from the highest level of consciousness. This, by the way, is contrary to our modern scientific point of view, where everything in the universe comes from matter. But in all spiritual teachings, including in the Gurdjieff teaching, everything in the manifested universe comes from the highest level of consciousness, the absolute or God or Allah, whatever word appeals to you, or Brahma. But then, of course, we can see in the manifested universe all the different creatures or various items, they all are at different levels of consciousness. Then a very strong suggestion that every level is wishing to evolve. As it were, it is trying to return home, return to the source from where it originated. For example, in the Gurdjieff teaching, these are actually very much the ideas that the moon is trying to evolve to the level of the earth, and the earth to the level of the sun, etc. So, not to take any of these things so literal-mindedly, because there is also the remark that in principle, the entire external universe can be mirrored inside us. So there is moon in you. This is a direct quote from Gurdjieff. There is moon in you. There is sun in you. Again, as I said, not to be taking these things so literal-mindedly, but to try to understand the level of, or the metaphorically, what then the moon is in me and the sun is in me. And that the moon is wishing to evolve, as is the sun. Every level is wishing to evolve. But in order to evolve, whatever level of consciousness, or now it'll be easier for me to say the particle of divinity or the element of the spirit, it needs to undertake some action in order to evolve. Therefore, it needs a body, which is the reason why this takes on a body. I'm using the word body here, but it includes the mind. Just a very simple reminder. Many of you, I'm assuming, coming from the Judeo-Christian background, would even recognize this remark that the word became flesh. Flesh there doesn't simply mean a hunk of meat. It became a whole living being. That is what I'm trying to also say here. So that this particle of divinity, at whatever level it now is trying to evolve. Therefore, it needs a body mind. And it takes on that body mind. So this body mind is intended to be the instrument to assist the evolution of the particle of the spirit that has come into this body mind. Now, with this general background here, now we ask this question. Miranda Salzman's remark that you don't love yourself enough, the self that needs and wishes to emerge. First of all, obviously, the background of it is that there is a self in my body mind, but it is not the body mind. It has taken on this body mind to undertake the appropriate kind of action so that it can actually evolve. Now, how do I connect with this? First of all, the general suggestion that if I am wholly being driven by my usual demands and needs of my body or the mind, then I cannot hear these subtle vibrations coming from something which is subtler than my body. And first of all, let me make sure to say as strongly as I can, there is no need to be against the body mind. If it is the instrument, why be against the instrument? The instruments needs to be actually sharpened. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be the right instrument. So nobody is recommending to be against the instrument. But the instrument seems to have a habit, usually driven by all our society and the social enterprise, all the social conditioning and education, to be trying to acquire something just to make the instrument stronger and stronger. So even the Buddha, as you know, was tested by Mara. What are the tests? Pleasure. Mara, this is the Indian equivalent or the Buddhist equivalent of the devil, by the way, just in case some people are not familiar with it. So he sends his own daughters to seduce the Buddha. So pleasure, then I will turn this mountain into a mountain of gold, wealth. I will give you sovereignty over the whole world, power. We can look at the world. It's easier for us to understand this looking outside, looking at what is going on in the world now, looking at the world leaders, for example. Is anything other than power, wealth, pleasure driving them? Self-occupation, self-centeredness, self-advancement. But what is more important from a spiritual point of view is to look at ourselves. Looking at the others is easier, and one can easily come to these conclusions. But to actually see, then very interesting remark actually of Rumi, if you have not yet seen the devil, go look in the mirror. Then one would see all of these aspects in oneself. that these forces are very strong. Competitiveness. There is the other side, by the way, what Mara also tries, or the devil tries. Fear of death. So he sends his armies to try to kill the Buddha. But the point I'm more trying to make here, if the Buddha is going to be tested and Christ was tested, why won't we be tested? And what is the test? The test really has to do with all the usual desires and temptations and the fear of losing this or losing my body, or fear of death. Which is the reason why Christ makes this remark in one of the Gospels, that the whole world is in the sway of the prince of darkness. But as I said, it's easier to look outside, but I need to see that I myself am most of the time in the sway of the prince of darkness, just driven by these needs and desires or wishes and temptations. Then how can I then listen or become even aware of the fact that there is a self in me that is coming from a higher level, which has taken on my body and my mind for its purposes, not for the purpose of the body. For me personally, this kind of thing is possible only when, at least temporarily, one can connect with what in the Gurdjieff teaching would be called the higher centers, the higher emotional and the higher intellectual centers. Otherwise, the lower centers are very active. The mind is carrying on and the emotions are carrying on. And the body is not related with any of this. So, very strong suggestion, and in practice one can try this again and again, that only when by the way, our work is only with the lower centers, emotional, intellectual, body, because the higher centers are not in my control. However, if I work, by which one of the meaning of that, or a practical meaning, is that if I try to bring some harmonization in my usual lower three centers, then one more or less naturally connects with the higher center. So those of you, since I'm assuming that most people here are involved in the work practice, someplace or the other, I invite you therefore to think that sometimes, for example, in a movements class, I could swear that I cannot possibly do these movements, partly because our movements instructors would add more complexity to it anyway, whatever you can actually do. But if one doesn't give up, then occasionally one finds oneself actually that the movement is being done, not by me, as if something else has taken on my body and mind. And sometimes in quiet work, when one can actually relate the mind and the body in a deeper and deeper sensation, I find, not all the time by any means, but sometimes a very subtle feeling, wishing to respond rather than to react. Usually, much of the time, I'm reacting based on my conditioning, what I have learned or heard or seen or imagined, and one association with the other. So, but then a wish to respond, which requires more listening rather than talking, more sense of oneness with the others, a slight sense of service. All that, at least as far as I'm concerned, is coming from the self that needs and wishes to emerge, but is usually not recognized by my usual self, and which is just busy with one thing or the other, occupied with thinking of this or that, or deciding this or that. However, it is important for us to see that what is behind that, if I am actually wishing to even relate with that kind of self, I need periodically to ask, am I essentially this body, which is clearly destined to die in a few decades? And for me now, at my age, it can hardly be more than a few years. But for everybody, it can't be more than a few decades. So is that what I am? Or am I this particle of the spirit that has taken on my body? Now, here, let me remind you of a very general remark in every spiritual teaching, that there are two in us. It has different labels. For example, St. Paul calls it our spiritual nature and carnal nature. Madame de Salzman calls it angelic nature and animal nature. I must say, angelic nature, I find it a little difficult for myself, but certainly slightly different from animal nature. Or sometimes she would even call it I and me. Or Gurdjieff had this lamb and the wolf. So there are different, or self and the ego. Here I should make one slightly more or less a linguistic remark, but this is actually more relevant to people usually brought up in the Indian tradition, because there, when the self is written with a capital S, the tendency is to jump to the general remark in the Upanishads that capital S self is one with Brahma, with the ultimate reality. That's not the remark here of Madame de Salzman, because she's talking about the capital, just because in English, how else do we convey slight separation from my usual self? But this self with a capital S in the remark of Madame de Salzman is not one with God. No, it is nevertheless closer to my real I. One might even say the angelic part of, using Madame de Salzman's expression, or the spiritual part that has taken on my body. So to not jump to the highest level, that's the remark I'm making, because this capital S self is also wishing to evolve. That is the call. That is why it has taken on my body. And so, having made that general, that's more or less a linguistic remark, helpful for people from India especially. Then, in order to relate with it, I need periodically to ask, am I this self, or am I what I usually call myself? What am I? And related with it, obviously, naturally the question arises, why am I here? If I'm just here for 5 or 6, 7, 8 decades, why would these energies, which are said to be intelligent and conscious, take the trouble to create this? Then sometimes in quiet moments, or moments of enhanced feeling. For example, I have had a situation, maybe most of you have had, one or two very close friends passed away. That temporarily brings one in a very different state. Or sometimes, in my own experience, just looking at the stars in the sky or at the ocean, the vastness always reminds one of one's smallness in this large universe. This was actually the reason I began this morning by saying there are trillions of galaxies, because that's always a little bit of a reminder of one's place in the universe, small place in the universe. And then one naturally wonders why. So for me, these are the kind of occasions in which there is more a sense of that there is a self that wishes and needs to emerge. And that if I can begin to pay more and more attention to it, trying to hear, usually, by the way, when I say hear, these are not words. One doesn't have intellectual clarity about this. Our feeling is touched. In fact, it's very important to keep in mind it's one of the tragedies of the so-called age of reason or the age of enlightenment. They seem to have forgotten that feelings are the first avenue towards truth. In fact, many of the great scientists even say that. It's actually a remark of Pascal. Heart has reasons that reason does not know. Usually they end up calling it intuition, that one learns something from intuition. But I am inviting you to realize that it's actually our feelings hear certain quiet whispers. Then sometimes an intellectual clarity can also come. But it is important not to be occupied with one expression or the other. Expression of truth is not the truth. What is important also to remind oneself, whatever my mind says or even thinks it understands or realizes, and it may understand something, mind does not experience. Experience is always by sensation or by feeling. So returning again and again to deeper and deeper sensation, it assists quietening the mind and harmonizing our different centers, therefore slightly more naturally relating us with the higher centers, which alone can in fact hear any of this or understand any of this. Therefore, to find occasions or situations in which one can actually hear some subtle whispers, or otherwise there is a certain activation or energization of various centers, as I mentioned, for example, occasionally in a movements class for me. So in quiet work or in movements class, or when there are other occasions of larger feeling, even watching the stars in the sky, those are the occasions or the situation in which a remark like this can be understood. The other thing which I earlier mentioned, that since the whole external universe can in principle be seen within ourselves, as if we are we can represent the whole universe. So when the call is that we need to work in order to assist the earth's receiving subtler energies, even the plants are receiving energies from the sun, and they give out something, oxygen, for example. So in a way, it's useful for us to remember that even just quite ordinarily, we won't even be able to survive if we were not receiving some energies from the sun. And just a quick reminder here that between today and a year from today, more than 120 million people will die on the planet. That's more than 200 people dying every minute. And as many and more will be born. So whatever function we are performing does not require any particular work from our side. Most of us are not working most of the time. But then Madame de Salzmans called it special function, that human beings have a special function. I would personally use the word they can have a purpose in addition to just function. But to fulfill the purpose or this special function requires work. Because if I work, then I can receive subtler energies. And one can see that my breathing changes, My body changes in its quality. It's really energy or even consciousness or attention in me, not my consciousness. And then, if that is true, after all, my body is actually the individualized earth. And if this work clearly has an impact on the quality of my body, this will be one way of understanding how our work can assist the quality of consciousness on the whole earth. But also to remind ourselves that no energy is without relationship with other energies. So it's almost like as if we are on a shifting slope. Even to stay where we are, we need to be trying to move upwards. Otherwise, we will naturally go downwards. So even to maintain our usual level of perception, consciousness, being, requires some work every day. But to enhance this would naturally require more work. But similarly on the planet. So if I can actually see or sense the change in the quality of my breathing, my body, if and when I work, that will be one way to understand how I can assist the planet Earth. After all, this is something very important in the work literature and theory, that we are responsible. My way of saying this is we are children of both heaven and earth, and we need to honor both the parents. It's not only a question of just going to heaven or just becoming purely spiritual. No, some of you may have read this remark of Madame de Salzman. This teaching is not meant to make us angels, but to make us men. So to be a real man on the planet, assisting the quality of the planet or the quality of the body, if you like. A contact with higher consciousness is required to change the quality of the body or to have a new body. On the other hand, a new body is required to have a new consciousness. So it's a spiral movement, not linear.